I appreciate you taking the time to introduce us this morning. One of the topics that we're going to be talking about today is really kind of critical to really the way that L&D is starting to move forward within the space, the business space as a whole. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Cavio. So Cavio is a learning consulting organization. Really, our passion is to drive business value through learning. And we do that through our performance solutions and our strategies that we put into place. So today we're going to be really talking about the whole idea of putting together that strategy that really helps drive the organization, the L&D organization, and the organization as a whole, the business component of it as a whole, driving that forward. And it's critically important to the organization that you do have a very solid learning strategy. What we do is we have our 4 key areas that we focus in on. So one of them is around our strategic learning consulting. That's what Ray's part of the organization is all about. We talked about those aspects of it. We also do provide learning performance solutions, so our instructional design and development for the learning solutions, as well as our learning technologies, so designing and developing e-learning, mobile learning, distance learning solutions, as well as doing execution support. So those times that you either need to have an extra set of hands or really be able to outsource parts of your organization. So as we transition into the presentation as a whole, it's really important to remember that as we look at what L&D means to the organization, it's very critical that we really look at how the organization views us as a whole. And really only 8% of CEOs have real insight into what L&D does. And that's on us. That's for us not having a plan to move forward with the organization and making ourselves transparent and that true support organization that really helps enable the business to move forward. So in a recent study that was done in 2017, what they found is that more than 40% of global L&D organizations don't have a learning strategy. So the issue with that is if you don't have a global learning strategy or a learning strategy as a whole, then all you are relegated to is a lot of the tactical implementation, order taking, all of those things that we strive not to be engaged in. And really 42% of the senior leaders feel that L&D lacks direction and vision. So they have no vision, no purpose, providing no value back to the organization. And they feel that it's really only driven because of what happens at the top. So the senior leaders inside the organization, not the L&D leaders, really drive the whole L&D experience. But on the other side, on the flip side, is that 67% feel that organizations with a learning culture are going to be the most successful. Well, part of defining your learning culture is really defining your learning strategy. What is your purpose? What is your vision? What is your mission within the organization to create that culture of learning? And creating the culture of learning goes beyond just people saying that yes, we are a great learning company, but really how is it woven into the fabric overall? And then lastly, really over 40% of organizations are really losing key talent because they're not supporting the development of their people. So if you have no plan, you have no plan to develop your people. So as we start to look at today, we want to make sure that we transition in to start talking really about the learning strategy. What is it? What does it do? And why is it important to an organization? Keep these things in mind as we start to move forward, because it'll be critical as you start to look at your organization to ensure that the business understands where L&D is heading. Where are you driving the organization to better support them in their mission, vision, and goals? So for today, what we're going to be talking about is what is a learning strategy? What does what does a learning strategy do for the organization? That it's really more than just a doctrine. It's more than just a piece of paper or a slogan you put on the wall. And then really we'll start to talk a little bit about building a learning strategy. And if we have time, we'll also do a couple of things or share with you a case study. But we want to make sure we have enough time at the end to be able to answer any questions that you have as we go through it. So, Ray, why don't you start talking about what is a learning strategy?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Jeff. And I welcome all of our listeners onto the webinar today. The topic of learning strategy is a very, very exciting topic. I find it to be a very fascinating topic because for a number of reasons, really. And really a lot of these reasons center around how organizations view learning strategy and the diversity behind that thought of what learning strategy is, what it means, and probably more importantly, how organizations actually execute on learning strategy and the things that really come from learning strategies when the organization uses them. So before we really get into the definition that Icavio uses for defining learning strategy and what it does, I'd be very interested to see what our audience has to say about this topic. So I invite all of our viewers to use the chat box down below, and we're interested in what you have to say about learning strategy. When you think learning strategy, or when your organization defines learning strategy, what does that mean to you? I'd be interested to see what you have to share. So I'll give you a few moments to put some information down in the chat box, and I'll share that as it continues to pop up.
Thanks, Ray. If you would like to go ahead and respond to Ray in the chat, that would be great. I do have a couple of responses here. One of them is vision, mission, values, purpose of learning organization. So one is certainly more specific, what the employee needs to know. Connecting the dots between business needs, performance, and learning. Organizational model, kind of federated or centralized, and governance. And how do we define the successful employee and how we support their success. The framework by which the organization will align the corporate goals with the performance of the employees. Certainly metrics, guide or roadmap for bringing an organization to its goals. Curriculum roadmap, vision, purpose, kind of where to play and how we enable the organization, solving from within, having a seat at the table when key decisions are made, and a plan aligned with the organization vision mission that enables you to get there, specifically for development of staff, not just training, but platforms, strategic competencies, and connectivity to OD. And those are just some of the responses that came in.
Thank you for that, Laura. And thank you also for participating. That is an incredible list of definitions of what learning strategy means to our audience. And we can really see, we really get an indication there of how diverse this topic is. We see everything from guides to strategies. We see tactics on design. There are a lot of great answers. And I would offer that none of these are wrong, but I will offer that if we can group some of these together, how we can think about people are typically seeing learning strategy within their organizations. As we've worked with different organizations, we've kind of seen two definitions emerge to the top, or two different perspectives, if you will, on what learning strategy is. On one side, it's a plan or doctrine, and we heard a lot of that from some of the responses from our viewers. It's a plan or doctrine that the organization uses to achieve some sort of strategic success of their learning efforts. On the other end of the spectrum, we see learning strategy really being viewed more as a process that an organization engages in, whether it's a design process or it's a tactical process to achieve some specific result. So from a high level, we've seen kind of come into two different areas, whether it's strategic high level or tactical, more ground level. And that's a very interesting perspective to take, because depending on which definition an organization adopts, the approach and the application of that learning strategy can vary significantly. So I'm going to offer to our viewers what we at Icavio would define learning strategy to be. And for us, learning strategy is a little bit more high level. We look at learning strategy to be a plan of action or a policy designed to drive the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or by being taught. Now, our definition, I have to admit, has seen some evolution over the years. When we first started talking learning strategy with organizations, we looked at it more as a philosophy, maybe a guiding beacon or a grounding principle in which to follow that kind of guides our thought process for learning. Like, this is how we should do learning, and that's how the organization wants to present itself as learning, as a learning organization, how the learning departments want to present themselves as well. Over the years, as we've kind of worked with different high-performing organizations, that definition has evolved. And that definition evolved for a very specific reason. We realized that a principle or philosophy is only part of the picture. A learning strategy really needs to guide the acquisition of knowledge through every aspect of the learner journey. Because it's not just the formal learning, and it's not just the philosophies of thought that we believe that really culminate into what an organization needs to do for talent and talent development. So that last part of the definition, the acquisition of knowledge through, was very important. And when we thought about through, and take for a minute to consider what through meant, is it through just the formal learning spectrum? We give training, and that is where learning strategy should stop, or should learning strategy be persistent and go beyond that? Our belief is that it goes beyond that because it does the entire performance support spectrum. We talk about how learning strategy guides acquisition knowledge through when you're taught, formal learning, when the organization really misses out on when the organization has on-the-job training or mentoring or coaching, so performance support, and really at every stage of the learner's journey. So a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more evolved over time, and this has really helped us to define where learning strategy sits and what learning strategy really is. I would take us to the CAVIO organizational maturity matrix, which some of us may be very familiar with here. But just for a little background, I'll explain it. The CAVIO maturity matrix is really how we help high-performing organizations find strategic, operational, and financial excellence in the learning and development functions. And really, the matrix has 4 different areas to it, from strategic to execution to capacity and expertise. And these 4 quadrants really guide the organization what they need to build or sustain to get to that high-performing state. Now, take for a moment the consideration of a learning strategy and where it sits on the maturity matrix. If we look at the different components of it from top to the bottom, it's very quickly apparent where a learning strategy should sit, and that is right at the top. When you think about organizational strategy, the learning strategy is the first 3 of the 7 pillars of organizational excellence. You think about the organizational strategy having the 7 components here. When you think about the strategic excellence component of that at the top left corner of strategy and expertise, you think vision, purpose, and value proposition. And one of these things that we can do in an organization to see how strong an organization has these 3 components is do a quick litmus test. And you can do this in your organization as well. It's a great way to find out how strong your organization's learning strategy is to go to different parts of your organization. Go ask 5 different members of your learning team from 5 different, preferably from 5 different locations within the organization, and ask them the simple question: what is the vision of learning within our organization? What is the purpose of learning? What is the value of learning? How closely aligned those answers are will give you a good indication, a good litmus test, if you would, of how strong your learning strategy is within the organization. And I think it's important also to point out that how strong the learning strategy is within the organization may be intended, or it may be organizationally driven, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Jeff, I pass it over to you at this point and kind of your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I wanted to add in here to make sure that, it's really important to understand that every organization has a learning strategy. And the important thing to remember is it's whether it's defined by the learning organization themselves, so whether you get to define it as a learning professional, or it's defined by the organization as a whole. So if it's not defined for you, or if you don't define it, it will be defined for you. And it's the ability to be able to look at the organization and clearly communicate what is the vision, purpose, and value you're going to be providing back to the organization. Now, the value piece itself, you have to think about it this way. You are a services part of the organization. The business itself has dollars to spend. They get to decide who they want to spend their dollars with. So when they look at internally within the learning organization, they have to say, well, do I want to spend my dollars internally with the organization there? Do I want to spend it externally with external partners? Or do I just want to start to set up my own satellite or shadow organization because I feel I can better control it myself? So if you don't do a good job of defining what your vision, purpose, and value is back to the organization will define it for you, and more often than not, they will take it away from you and start to build up their own little pop-up organizations or start to have that external spend. So that's why it's important as we start to transition over to what really does a learning strategy do for you as a learning and development organization?
Absolutely, and I think those are important things to consider. So conceptually, we talk about what is a learning strategy. We talk about the value, the purpose, and the value proposition, the vision, the purpose, and the value proposition for an organization, for a learning strategy. But what does it exactly do for an organization? What is the purpose? What is the outcome of having a learning strategy? Really, as we get into these points, we want to think about what our expectations around learning are. As organizations, how do we view learning? Do we view learning as a transactional or experiential event? Do we view learning as a means to an end or just the end itself? What is fascinating is we really look at the high-performing organizations. They take a very specific look at talent and talent development, very prescriptive, if you would. Organizations that tend to perform well spend a lot of time cultivating and developing talent. Talent is arguably a central strategy for these organizations as they take a very serious look at the value proposition of developing that talent to be able to respond to the different competitive markets that they're facing. If you think back to the Cavio maturity model, learning strategy serves to establish the expectation of learning across the organization, what it does, why it does it, and how it does it, and just as importantly, what learning will not do. The reason why it establishes expectations is rather simple, because it empowers talent within the organization to execute learning and development from a central set of values, beliefs, and attitudes, rather than what can typically happen organically, which is where different organizations, different individuals will own their own sets of values, beliefs, and attitudes, and have learning become emergent from their sets of expectations. So a learning strategy really solves that part of the equation. It sets the central set of values, beliefs, and attitudes for the organization so that behavior should be consistent across the organization. Now, I'd invite us to consider the word empower for a moment. This is a very critical word because it really speaks to the view on learning. Do we view learning to be either a force to empower behavior, or do we view learning to be a force to control outcomes? And let me explain. Think for a moment of how learning activity, or think of for a moment how learning activities work within your particular organizations. Are they designed to empower behavior or dictate control? To illustrate the difference, let's for a moment compare the two perspectives and what they mean to learning and development. A behavior represents how an organization or how the individuals will conduct themselves. That is very important when you really let that sink in, because it's rather what they will do. It's more important to focus on why they will do it. The approach is grounded in the philosophy that you build the values, behaviors, and attitude, and your desired behaviors will be emergent and a manifestation of those central set of values, beliefs, and behaviors. So instead of letting those values, beliefs, and behaviors be different between individual to individual, the organization says, this is what's important to us. This is what we dictate will be our core tenets. These are the values that we hold that are true. These are the beliefs that we will operate on. These are the attitudes that we expect and foster within our talent. And the big change here is, instead of being reactive, talent is now able to proactively respond to different development needs, different business responses, and ultimately the way the organization changes and adapts over time, because they can now act on the central beliefs and values instead of being controlled. So let's look at the other side of the coin here, what control is and what it means for an organization. If you think about control, control represents how the organization dictates and directs activities. So when we think about control, let's think about what can we really control. Are we putting in place talent activities that say you shall or thou shalt do this? This is how you will. This is what you will not. What do these controls really do? We would propose that controls really represent our tendency to believe that we can have power over people to control what they will not do, rather than empowering them to learn, develop, and cultivate leadership capabilities to display the behaviors that we want them to have, rather than just be able to do what we tell them to do. And Jeff, I'd offer on your perspective on this subject too, because I know you speak a lot on this particular topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you start to look at focusing in on the things of telling people what they can't do. So adult learners don't like to be told what not to do, quite frankly. So you have to really look at a different way of approaching learners and really just adults as a whole. Instead of focusing on what you can't do, you should focus on really empowering them to be able to understand a broader spectrum or a broader scope of what it is within the construct of what you're trying to elaborate to them. So as an example, I'll use Caterpillar as an example. One of their core tenets around their whole compliance, around safety and compliance, and instead of saying that you won't do certain things, so you won't show up inebriated into the work environment, you won't put your arm inside of you need to use two hands in the type of machinery that's there, is they use this phrase over and over again to empower the employees, which is Their job is really to get home safe every day. That's their guiding philosophy. And what that does is it gives them a different perspective of how they look at safety, how they look at compliance, because these things are not meant to be a punishment. These things are not meant to be the hammer. These things are meant to have them understand that really what the core goal is to empower them to be safe, to empower them to be able to get home to their families at the end of the day, and realize that that's at the basis for all reasons underneath the compliance and the safety regulations that are being put into place. And when they put it into that framework, when you start thinking about it from that standpoint, you're now empowering, you are really looking at behaviors, and you can't really control every single thing that happens every day. But if you give them the construct to be able to empower them to change their behavior, to really focus in on those right things, that's really the difference between the whole empowerment versus the control piece.
I think that's an absolutely great example. And I'd also offer up the example from the military. When we would equip and empower, and those who are familiar with my background, I have a background in L&D with the United States Marine Corps. And when we would go to develop young individuals to lead very, very dynamic and austere teams here, when we would teach them how to respond to different situations, the philosophy behind preparing people to be able to respond to the different things the environment can throw at you wasn't about do this in every environment. It was to equip and empower people with the skills and capabilities they needed to make their own decisions and let behavior be emergent from those decisions. And that allowed these teams, these groups, to be able to accomplish very, very powerful and very creative solutions to accomplish what they needed to accomplish. And the same parallel holds true for corporations as well. Do we want people to be able to take control of their environment and come up with better solutions and better outcomes as the environment around us shifts and changes? And that's really the fundamental argument between, do you approach it from a control aspect or you control it from a behavior aspect? I'd also offer another view on the topic as well. We use our maturity model to really help organizations build that organizational maturity, but it does another thing too. It helps us segregate the difference between strategy and control. Because it might sound like I'm being very critical of control, like we shouldn't have control at all. Well, that's not true. Control does help us in a lot of ways. Those are tactical. Tactical controls help us guide what type of behaviors are manifested. Let me correct that. To decide what actions are manifested by the behaviors that we want. So if we look at the maturity model and we look at how the different levels of maturity are accomplished through an organization, we notice that you have the organizational strategy, the vision, the purpose, the value proposition, the business plan, and the financial aspects of it that make an organizational great. The next layer of that is the organizational capabilities. Can they operate with strategic, operational, financial excellence to get that working well? The bottom level is where we start to hit the controls, execution methods. How are we going to action upon behaviors that we want our talent to display? And those controls are seen very, very prevalent in these tactical measures there. So the organization can then look and make logical decisions on what those tactical controls will be. So if you want, for example, specific things to happen in quality assurance or instructional design, where we see a majority of controls really happen, you already have a good foundation at the strategic level to guide what those tactical levels should be. So
Ray, I want to add in one thing here is to say, when you start to think about the organizational strategy to the execution methods, think about it from the standpoint of, every year the senior leadership comes out with their strategic vision for the year. It doesn't tell you exactly how it's going to get there. They paint the big vision, the big picture of where they want to go. And when you kind of think of the whole funnel piece, is that you have this very large vision and there's not a lot of control there, but as you start to dissect that and really start to pull it apart, that as you get closer to the execution, you get closer to the tactics and you get closer to really being able to define how things get there, and that's where the controls start to come in. But when we're talking about the strategic piece, the top level, the organizational strategy components, these are really the big picture items. These are the guiding principles, that North Star that you want to be able to focus in on. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
Absolutely true. So let me ask the audience, let me turn it back to our viewers here. What does your learning strategy do? Is it intended more to control behavior or empower behavior? And you don't necessarily need to respond to this, but I would ask if you do share with us, and we can kind of see from our audience how they view learning strategy or how they view learning strategies executed within their current organizations.
Ray, I do have a couple comments I'd like to certainly share and get your thoughts on. First of all, one of our attendees has mentioned that it's control. So their learning strategy helps to control, and one said probably a bit of both. So the other question that I had was one person had mentioned that their learning strategy helps them understand their strengths and weaknesses in their organization and ways to solve within. So there's a little bit of a combination there for you.
Absolutely. This is pretty consistent with what we see when we work with different organizations. Really kind of the guiding factors, let me even step back and say that the idea of empowering learning, while it's not a new topic, it tends to be a rather new topic in the organizations that are trying to move away from transactional learning development to a more empowered business partner version of learning and development. So as this transition continues to happen, more people are moving away from, well, learning and development is a control. For example, we need training, give training, there's your tactical measure, to we need training. What does this mean to the business? How do we drive performance? And how do we get to where we need to be? And as that conversation continues to become a more prevalent conversation in organizations, we start to see the evolution of activities go away from, sure, we'll create this course or create this training program to you two. Let's discuss what it is you actually need. Let's discuss what our users, our audience actually needs. And let's talk about what the business needs and how do we reconcile all these and put these together. And that's some of the layers that we see with strategy in general too, because at the top level, you have to understand what the business needs before you can get down to the bottom level of what tactics go in to guide that in a very specific direction.
Ray, and to your point, there's one of our attendees had mentioned that it was about alignment. So I think that's no pun intended aligned with what you just mentioned. But in addition, we have someone who mentioned that they empower as they're moving towards a lean management system so that their L&D is very behavior changing based. It's based on behavior changes.
Absolutely. I think those are great points. Please, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I agree. So the thing is, I think people. So Ray mentioned a little bit about the layers of strategy. So there were several different layers as you start to look at your different strategic view of the organization. So at the high level, it is around alignment. So how do you align to the business goals and objectives to be able to enable them to achieve their business goals? So you have to really look at how is your organization going to empower the rest of the organization? Then you start going down the layers, and so then you have your content strategy. So how are you going to, what types of content, what's your method? How are you going to deploy learning across the organization? Then you get into more of the methods and the tactics. So you have multiple layers of a strategy as you go through it. But when you talk about really that overarching organizational strategy, this is really where you paint the big picture, the big vision. As you start to, once you have that in place and everybody understands really where are you heading over the next 3 years, what are the types of things that the offerings that you're going to have? What are the types of approaches that you're going to have? So is it, and I'll use an example that that Ray had done mentioned in the past is, is it that is it speed, or is it, speed is valued more than the quality of the interaction? So there are a lot of organizations that are very transactional in how they approach things. It's not a bad thing to say, we want to be quick to market. We're not going to be worried about the eye candy. So that is one of the pieces that you can look at as one of your organizational approaches. And then you start to really, the additional strategies start to evolve after that as you start to get into the different layers.
Absolutely. So we've covered quite a bit so far. We're kind of at the halfway mark. Let's take a look at what our audience has to say. What are some questions we have so far? Maybe we can field or elaborate on some of the things we discussed before really moving into what a learning strategy means for an organization and some of the case studies that we've worked on. Any common questions or open-ended things happening for us, Laura?
Ray, yeah, I do have a question in regards to the use of the terms behavior and culture interchangeably. Do you use those interchangeably?
I personally do not. Behavior speaks to the different things that emerge from the values, beliefs, and attitudes. It's the actions that the individual take. Culture is kind of the culmination of all the behaviors and what they mean when they work in concert. So it's a little bit higher level to me. And we don't always have control of that culture, and it's not always consistent because culture kind of evolves over time, but it's more of a conceptual overview of all the different behaviors and as they come together and how those behaviors interact with each other, what behaviors are considered acceptable, what behaviors are considered best practices, what behaviors are kind of those things that we don't want to talk about or touch or do. And those are the things that really differentiate for me what a behavior and a culture is. But great question, absolutely great question.
Cool. Okay, we have another question, and there's actually, this is, oh, go ahead.
Laura, I just wanted to add in, so the way that I think about culture is the swagger that the organization has. It's the common shared values that everybody has together. So when you think of like a great teams in sports, the culture that's driven around, excellence and how you're going to approach things together. Those are the types of things that when you look at culture, it's the overall swagger, it's the overall approach. It's how you view yourself and your organization. It's who you are at your core. So those are made up, as Ray said, those are made up of the values, the beliefs, all of those things combined together. But when you look back at your organization, it's who are you as a group, as a group of individuals. Who are you at your core? Who are you when? What would people say about you and how you approach things? That's really more of your culture.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Thank you. One question I have, it's kind of a combination question, but where does the sponsorship for the learning strategy need to come from? And can you build a learning strategy without management support?
That is an absolute great question, and is a question we are faced with all the time. The short answer to that is you absolutely want leadership support, because if you think about the top level of organizational strategy and what it means, how can leadership not be involved if you're talking about mission, vision, and value proposition? They absolutely should be involved, but I understand that sometimes they're not for various reasons. Maybe they haven't gotten to the table yet thinking of learning and development as a business partner. Maybe it's just not one of the forefront and it's something that still needs to be evolved and understood. Maybe the view of learning and development just needs to be explained. There's lots of reasons of why that particular mentality might exist. But at the end of the day, I view our job is to really help learning leaders talk to organizational leaders and have that seat at the table. Now, to the second part of that question, we absolutely can start to design and develop learning strategies in the absence of leadership support. So there's a great advice that I was once given a long time ago, and that's really start with where you're at and really adopt that principle moving forward as well. It's if you adopt and develop your own learning strategy in the absence of leadership support, yes, there's going to be some reconciliation and managing up, as we say, as we continue to execute on these and why we have chosen this particular area. But the benefits will speak for themselves, and we'll start inviting those leaders to come to the table as they see the results of these best practices in place. So it's a little bit of a two-part thing. It'd be great to start with that leadership support up front. It'd be great to have them at the table, and a lot of really high-performing organizations have very strong leadership support when it comes to talent and talent development. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily need it. You can start with where you're at. You can model the way. We've seen that be a very successful approach, rather than the typical approach where organization consistently looks at learning and development as a cost center, which means it's the first thing on the chopping block when budgets are cut. It's the first thing on the chopping block when we need new resources or new headcounts. It's the first thing that's to go when we need to start doing development plans or figuring out how to get our talent where they need to be, even though there's other priorities like R&D or any of the other things that an organization may want to focus on.
And one other thing I would throw in there is it also depends on where your learning organization is currently. So when you came into learning organization, is it a turnaround or a startup? Those types of things, you would probably start with understanding the needs of the organization and creating your learning strategy, not necessarily in concert with other senior leaders, because you have to have time to build the capabilities and the capacity that you're going to provide to the organization. So if you come out of the gate saying, we're going to be doing all these great things, here's what we're going to be doing, here's who we are, here's our value proposition, the issue is that those become false promises in the beginning. So it's important that before you start to, especially in a turnaround or a startup of a learning organization, you want to be able to align to the organization and start to build the capabilities and capacity before you really start to fully engage or fully lever the rest of the business. So there's an alignment piece that you want to start, but sharing your total vision can lead to false promises or false expectations up front. If it's one that's fully established, you need to make sure that you fully engage the senior leadership.
I would add one last point to this too. I think a lot of this really touches and speaks to the point of coming to the table as a business partner, the business of learning within organizations. Instead of being a transactional arm of the organization, how we come to the table and present ourselves as business leaders, as people that drive a very critical aspect of business success. And that learning strategy, no matter where you're at in organizational maturity or where you're at as far as seats at the table, is one of the foundational components to running learning like a business and making sure that we are really hitting what we need to do to develop talent in ways that make sense to build sustainable, high-performing organizations. And that'd be the only add-on I would say to either point. I think it's a very great question.
Great, thanks. I have one last question. Can you please comment on the global learning strategy in the context of a governance model, and as they talk about centralized versus decentralized?
Oh, another great question. So governance is a topic that comes up quite a bit in almost every conversation we have around learning strategy or content strategy, and here's why. A lot of times governance has a very negative connotation in organizations. A lot of times governance is really relegated down to a policing action. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not be a part of this. You shall do this. But that's only one very small and arguably marginal point of governance. Governance serves to be a very specific resource within an organization. That resource is to act as a guide and as a point of all things good for the organization, because what are best standards and who controls it? If the organization doesn't have an entity that controls it, trust me, the individuals will. And that doesn't mean it's bad. People are naturally, in my opinion, people are predispositioned to do a good job. Nobody goes to work and says, I want to do a bad job today. Nobody goes to work and say, you know what, I'm just going to do the worst job I can do. Everybody's trying to do their best in their own ways. So we don't disrespect that and we don't say it's not there. However, there's a difference between doing what's right for you and doing what's right for the organization. The question is, who's in control of that? And is it defined? Governance helps establish those left and right lateral limits, as we'd say in the military, basically those guidelines that really tell us what are best practices to the organization and why are they best practices. And yes, there is the component. At the end of the day, we do have to have an answer for that one issue we know comes. This is best practice. This is what the organization says we need to do. But you know what? This person still isn't doing it anyway. You do need an accountability piece to solve the people aspect of the business. You do need a way to hold people accountable and know that they are accountable to the best practices of the organization and that they need to be consistent with what the organization deems as best practice. So where does governance sit? Very, very much at that organizational strategic level. They should be very connected with what the organizational strategy is. They should be very connected with what the learning strategy is, and they should be very connected with the business to understand their needs and act as that intermediary.
And I'll just throw one thing in there, especially in a federated model. Think of the governance as really empowering those other parts of the organization. So you're providing those best practices, those tools and templates, those methodologies, those from a tactical standpoint. You're providing them the framework to be successful. So you're empowering them to do good things within their part of the organization. The only time when governance should become that, that hammer, I guess, is when there's a lack of accountability inside of an organization. And Ray alluded to that. If people aren't following those best practices, they aren't following those guidelines or those guideposts that are there for them, and people are running off, It's at that point in time you need to kind of pull those folks in, because it's important to the organization from the standpoint of providing quality solutions that drive the business value back to the organization. And if somebody is not doing the things that they need to do to help improve the business, then that's a different discussion. But the governance model really should help empower the rest of the organization to do the things that they need to do to ensure that it's a unified approach going forward.
I think these were absolutely great questions that were brought up. I think in the interest of time, we'll move to the next topic here, which is really talking about learning strategy beyond the strategy itself. You know what, Jeff, I think you have a very good perspective on this, so I'll kick this over to you for this particular topic. I think it's very, very important that we consider what learning strategy does for organizations and why it's important, what they do if they have one.
Sure. So when you look at learning strategies as a whole, so it's important that so when you look at a learning strategy overall, they have to be lived, they have to be experienced, and they really truly have to be valued not only to the organization as a whole, but to each individual. So really, before we dive into some of the experiences helping our clients establish this overall learning strategy, there's more important things we need to consider. So at the end of the day, a learning strategy is nothing more than just a document that is shared. It's a unifying document talking about all of the different ways that you're going to achieve those goals and objectives that you set out, not only for the learning organization, but also how you're supporting the business as a whole. So really making sure that you take the time to prepare, vet, and establish a learning strategy is really a large undertaking. It's, as we talk through this, our job is to make it sound a little bit easy, and it can be a very deep and heady process as you go through it, and it really requires the highest level of leadership support and a detailed understanding of all of the aspects of your organization's learning and technology ecosystems that are in place, so that you can take all those things into consideration as you go through it, and really understanding not only where the business is now, but also where it's going. So when you complete your learning strategy, it's really only the beginning of the process. It's a living, breathing document. So it's important that you continue to come back to the document. You review it every 6 months to ensure, at least every 6 months, but up to a year, to ensure that you are still on track, or did the business shift and change and you need to adjust your perspective based on the new environment that you find yourself in. So to be truly effective, the learning strategies must be ingrained in the culture of the organization. So the organization needs to understand really very clearly what the learning strategy is, what it does, and truly how it's going to be executed. That's where you start to get into the tactical components of there. So we talked about the different layerings that's in there. Just like any guiding document, it's only as effective as how it's executed. So it's just because you have the document, you still need to then start to break it apart to talk about now how are you going to execute to that document. So the learning strategy is the organizational learning strategy is at the highest level, and then you start to build the tactics and capabilities as you start to break that apart to say, now how are we going to do this? How are we going to execute on this vision? So that way we know that we are going to execute at the highest level, providing the best support and driving the highest level of business value back to the organization.
I would also offer that how many times have we seen in an organization, and I open this to the entire audience, think about how many times we see a value statement on the wall or a cultural statement being emailed out, and how many times we see these values and principles being put in front of us in mission statements. And think about the discrepancy, and I'm sure it's not in the organizations you're in now, but we could probably all think of that organization that has value statements but doesn't live up to them. Or more importantly, doesn't execute on them in the way that the organization intends them to be executed upon. That's the same issue that you can see with the learning strategy. If the organization doesn't believe in and have those different values, visions, and value propositions really embedded into how the organization thinks and acts, then it's not worth more than the paper that you put onto it. And that's a lot of effort that goes into developing a learning strategy. On average, a learning strategy can take anywhere from 30 to 90 days to build, depending on the complexity of the organization and how much information needs to be put together. But that's only the beginning. Once it's built, once you've said, these are the values that we find important, this is the vision of learning at our organization, and this is the value proposition that we bring with clarity, then that's just the beginning. Now you have to start executing on that. Now you have to start making sure that that's part of the culture, that people are actually displaying and believe in those different things, different components of the strategy that you've taken the time to put together. So it's a very important consideration when you think of a learning strategy, to think beyond just what it is and having one. You think about how you execute on it, how you make it a part of the culture, and how you make it a real part. And I offer a perspective of looking at different high-performing organizations. The ones with big names that are doing it very well, you can look at it and you talk to their talent will tell you with clarity what it is. And their managers will tell you what they're looking for. I'll offer the example of Southwest Airlines. They hire for attitude. They know they hire for attitude. You ask anybody in that organization, they know what they look for in talent. It's very impressive to see. See the same thing at many different organizations that say, this is what we find is to be very important with our talent. They have crystal clear clarity around that, and you can see the outcomes that that clarity provides them, but it has to be lived. It cannot just be stated. With that, I'd like to turn us to a little bit some of the funner parts. I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, before we have to get into Q&A. So maybe we give a few case studies. What do you think, Jeff?
Sure, sounds good. I'll let you start off and give the kind of the background to it.
Absolutely. So we worked with a few different organizations when it comes to learning strategy. So I think kind of the overview of a typical issue that's brought to us. So a large organization, in this case, I'm thinking of one of the retail organizations we worked with, really sought out to establish a central strategy to guide the organization. And the reason why they wanted this central strategy is because their learning and development had evolved rapidly with the growth of the organization itself. What the organization was really seeing is that they had learning functions across the organization, completely decentralized, but there wasn't really a centralized vision. There wasn't centralized guidance for all of them. Everybody was doing it their own way. They were using their own practices. They were using their own activities. And more importantly, they were using their own sets of technology, their own sets of vendors, and their own sets of budgets to do it. And then can you imagine the inconsistencies and the inefficiencies when it came to planning, to strategic planning, and even more importantly to the organization, to financial planning, what that meant to the organization. So they're looking to solve this particular issue and what they could do about it. So when we really looked at coming into to helping the organization, we needed to say, okay, well, we have to find a sense of identity for your organization before you can start federating your model. A lot of people are doing things very well for their organization. They've been doing it for years. The cowboy and hero mentality. They have been working very hard to be very successful in their respective areas of the business. So if you come in right off the bat and say, we're going to put a learning strategy over you and rule the roost in this, you're going to be basically dismissing all the hard work that these organizations have been doing for a very long time. So instead of doing that, you had to have a sense of value. And that sense of value needed to be crowdsourced and really bought into from the organization before you just push it out. So really being inclusive instead of prescriptive with the different groups. So we went in and we started talking. So we're going to establish a central set of values for the learning function. Let's find out what values are already there. And that was the first step. We started investigating what makes learning tick within the organization. Why is it important? What's very specific to their ecosystem? Why do they make the choices they do? And let's start emerging them from the top. Where are the best practices? Where are things that people weren't aware of? Let's start having those conversations and really driving out what those central values were. So we got the values established to it, and we really helped them generate it. And that was really the art of it. The organization itself really was facilitated up to the point that they could define their own values. And that way it was an internal discussion of what was important to them rather than somebody, whether it was an outside consultancy or somebody from somewhere else in the organization telling them what that was. We also did that for the same set of belief systems. We talked about why did people take the approaches they were taking. It was e-learning being used because there was a need for scalability or because you were more comfortable as a system. We're using these sets of technology because it was easier for what you're doing or because it met the criteria of your particular audiences. Do you even have an audience analysis, and how are you really working with your audiences to really serve their particular needs? How are you connecting all this up to your particular departmental needs and more importantly to the next level, to the function of the organization? So we really kind of helped them to figure all that out, kind of identify what they're doing, and help them solve those different issues.
And then the other part of it I would add to that is, if you notice that as Ray was talking through this, he didn't speak anything about assessing the current expertise inside of each of those different groups across the globe. Didn't talk about really assessing the content that was currently there. So it's really starting out in the beginning to say, what is the overall vision of this organization? And then as you start to look at what the vision is, then you can turn and start looking at, do I have the right capabilities? Do I have the right technology in place? Is the ecosystem there to be able to then start to pull those pieces together as you look at pulling the organization together, instead of pulling the organization together and then trying to figure out what it is that you have and then creating the strategy from it. So start with the strategy in mind and then start to look at how you pull your organization together. What we did here is say, okay, let's focus on what is the future state of this new organization going to be, and then start to look at, okay, now that we have what that vision is, now let's start to assess each of those different organizations against that vision, and really find and identify what is considered or what will be considered best practice. So it allows you to be able to have that area that you can start to push towards and really focus in on. And we found great success in doing that with the organization because it made it easier to really look at all the different segregated groups around the globe, to be able to start to pull them together. And it really created kind of a unified approach and a unified, I guess, if you look at the unified belief system and culture system that was put into place immediately, so that everybody saw where the organization was heading, everybody could believe in it. So it made that change management process a lot easier as we helped them continue to kind of pull those pieces together.
Absolutely. I think those are great points. The adoption on this particular project was amazing. And I really attribute a lot of that success to the fact that a lot of these different elements of the learning strategy were emergent. They were organic to the organization, and they were really owning that. And I think organizations can take that. They don't need a consultancy necessarily to do that. You just get adoption through your organization by including these different elements and having them have a seat at the table to help shape what that really means. Now, there is a lot of coaching, there's a lot of discussion on how you can shape that in a good direction, but overall, when it came to the implementation and actually the execution, the actioning on the learning strategy, the organization had far less resistance than some of the other clients that we worked with that say, you shall do this particular issue, because then there's always the topic of, well, now you have to overcome more resistance and more of, you've told people what to do, now you have to get them on board.
Great.
So as I look at the time here, please, yes, I'll pass back over to you, Laura.
Cool, Ray. I've got one other comment here, and certainly I think this is important. If you don't have the technology to execute your strategy, but will in the near future, would you recommend executing the strategy and scaling back to the current available technology, or deploy learning assets to see what is adopted to inform the acquisition of the technology, the creation of assets for the future state?
Ray, I'm going to jump in here because
please.
I'm a bit of a technology nerd, so I'm going to jump in for a second. But,
go right ahead.
So the thing is as you start to look at, especially technology, it evolves so quickly over time. And if you have the idea of where you want to head, you want to make sure that the learning assets, the technology doesn't exist yet. The learning assets that you create should be aligned to meet up with the technology when it becomes available. I know a lot of people are starting to focus in on trying to do more around. So, as an example, let's say your organization isn't ready for mobile delivery yet. You haven't adopted that technology. It doesn't mean you shouldn't make that part of your learning strategy and actually start to execute that inside of when you create learning assets. Because when the organization is ready to go, you just basically, you can look at them and go, we've been ready for a while. So you've already basically beat their expectations. You're there when they need you to be there. So you should look at, from a tactical standpoint, developing and designing for what the future state will be when the technology gets there. So that way you can align quickly with when the new technology gets brought into place.
Absolutely great perspective. The only possible addition that I could have to this is I like a saying in this particular ism, if you would, is that you build a strategy, you find tools to support a strategy. You don't build a strategy for a tool. Because oftentimes what we'll see here is if you pick the tools without in the absence of a strategy, you tend to break those tools to meet a perceived strategy, rather than having a strategy that guides where you want to go and finding the right tools to support that. And if you notice throughout the entire presentation, very rarely did we ever talk about modalities or execution methods. And we did that very prescriptively, because those should change and adapt over time, especially with how fast the ecosystem is evolving. New technologies are coming out daily, capabilities are being expanded. Really, if we limit ourselves to the technology we do, our strategies will be very limited to the technology that we're using, rather than figuring out what the strategy is and finding the best use of technology that supports it and allowing that strategy to, or excuse me, allowing those technologies to evolve over time as it makes sense for the organization. So hopefully that answers that question. That was a very good question.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. I have a couple other questions real quick. I probably have time for one more question looking at the time. One comment is about what do you recommend for creating the education for helping a culture articulate what they might want? Sometimes it feels really complex to build internal buy-in for a particular culture. So what are some suggestions around that?
Oh, very easy. This is a personal favorite topic of mine. The quick answer to this is steal the best practices from our sister organizations, marketing. Marketing knows how to answer this question very well. And we as learning leaders and learning practitioners have a lot to learn in this area, in my particular opinion, of how we can actually get people to buy in. I mean, think about Apple, for example. How many of us are ready to rush out to buy the new iPhone that has one new, I'm exaggerating, of course, one new feature? And that is really a product of really effective marketing, brand recognition, and brand awareness. And if we can embed some of those principles into it, we'll start to realize that adoption isn't as difficult as we think it is. It's just an effort of careful planning and campaigning.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. So any other last comments either of you have before we move on to the our final slide?
I would probably just lead it. Well, first off, it's an honor to be able to speak to everybody here in the audience. I thank you for taking the time to listen to us, to our perspectives on the topic, but I would like to leave everybody with a thought from Alvin Toffler. It's really the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read, write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. It's a very powerful statement that I really use to guide the way I think about learning and development. And when we think about why learning strategies exist, why talent development is important, why equipping and empowering people to succeed is such an important part of our organizations, this statement really speaks to that for me. The people, the successful people of the future aren't the ones that are going to be able to swing the hammer the best and have years and years and years of swinging the hammer. But those people are going to be, the most successful people are going to be those people who can take that hammer and get very good at it and be able to put that hammer down when the hammer is no longer relevant and pick up the next tool and get very good at it, be adaptable and resilient. So I offer that up as a parting thought for me. And I'll kick over to Jeff for anything from you.
Nope, I think you've summed it up great.
Thank you.
And I just pass back over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Jeff, very much for your very informative webinar today. Our next presentation will be on Tuesday, January 16th in 2018 from 10 to 11, same time Central. And our presenter will be Joey Marshall, who is one of our Learning Solution Managers. Thank you again for your participation and your time today. If you need to contact us or would like to contact us, here's our contact information. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.